I'm going to ask each of the panel members just to give a brief introduction about themselves and your immediate reflections on what you've heard today and what you've managed to read of the roadmap. So starting with Vicki.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. So I'm Vicki Hird. I'm the strategic lead on agriculture at the Wildlife Trust, which is 47 separate charities, so quite an interesting federation to work on. And they do have a lot of farmland. They're a very big landowner in terms of reserves and farms that they hold. So we're thinking about this a lot, but also, importantly, that 70% of the land is farmed, and it's the Wildlife Trust. We care about wildlife, but we're very much in the space of thinking about the wildlife everywhere and restoring wildlife everywhere. And 30 by 30 is a focus, but it's about all of nature everywhere. And I think one of my reactions to this, I think it's great. I think to look at it from a systems perspective and a multifunctionality perspective is absolutely where we were going. And there's a phrase I just read at the back about how quickly we need to do it. It's really urgent because, to be honest, I've been working on this for 35 years. And, you know, we have been saying a lot of this for those 35 years, not as well, and you've got fantastic data behind your work, but we need it that urgently. And nature sometimes feels in these kind of things as a bit of an add-on. We've got to restore biodiversity and everything, but actually it's clear that it's fundamental, not only for our food security, it's fundamental for our security, because of the way in which it can tackle climate change problems and flood alleviation and ensuring that we have safe water, safe space, safe soil to both live on and live from. So having biodiversity as a sort of sometimes seems as an add-on, and I think that's in your report is probably throughout, not just about net zero, but about diversity, and I think that's welcome, but we've got to be very careful. The only other thing, my immediate reaction always is, and people who know me will sigh because I'm a bit of a stuck record, talking about the supply chain and where the money goes. And I'll give you two figures. You talk about, I think it was 2.4 billion in subsidies, which we now call payments, because they're payments for public goods, not subsidies in England anyway, but compare that with the 128 billion in the agri-food chain. Where does that money go? How's that part of the just transition for farmers? How's that part of a policy change that directs that money to ensure that farmers can go through that transition? And just finally, on the, I would say we've got to, if we're going to talk about diets and good health and good diets, we've got to talk about marketing and advertising. And maybe it's in the report, I haven't looked at that yet, but there's £420 million spent on just advertising, not marketing, advertising of food. You know, we've got to think about how that should change.
Thank you, Vicki. Ali.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. So I'm Ali. I'm a public health nutritionist. I'm also an AFN champion. So I've been really closely involved in the health element of this report. And actually, I would say as a nutritionist, it's one of my only opportunities ever in my 20-year career to be part of a report truly looking at the entire spectrum of the food system. So I think that's great, and that's absolutely where we need to be. In terms of some quick fire reflections, so the number one for me here is that net zero and human health are not in competition. These two areas are complementary, and in fact we can only tackle them both through a systems-led approach. I think what we've really tried to show in the report, and I hope this comes across, that is to improve the nation's diet is absolutely vital for people's quality of life, for our life chances as a population, but also for workforce productivity and the NHS's capacity to continue treating patients with business as usual. The cost of inaction on diets is vast, and Sue's team has generated some great data on that, which we include in the report, but nearly £270 billion every single year is a consequence of lost productivity, and the NHS is picking up that bill. Our population is getting sicker. Vicki's just talked about the length of time that she's been working in the food system. I've been working in nutrition for an incredibly long time, and actually Tim spoke about levels of adult obesity. In Bradford district, where I live, 40,000 children are leaving primary school every year living with obesity, and that is setting them up for a lifetime of chronic disease. So I don't think that those health issues exist in a vacuum. And what we eat is directly linked to biodiversity, how we use our land, our soil and our water quality, and ultimately those are the conditions that we need to deliver healthy diets now and in the future. So that's just a few quick reflections from me. So.
Thank you, Ali. Sue.
Shall I go with this one?
Yes.
I think this is a really important report, and I am delighted to see it, not least because it reflects so many of the same things that we said in our own report in 2019 when we were set up as a commission back in 2017. And so I'm taking a lot of inspiration from this quote up here, that it lends radiance to them that endured in the heat of the conflict. We should be looking bloody glowing, shouldn't we, under those circumstances? Because I think, as my colleagues have said, some of us have been saying these kinds of things for a long time, and saying them again in this really brilliant and clear way is really, really important. But my mind is already, as a researcher, thinking about two things. So what stops change happening? And what do we need to do next? What do we need to do next? What are the next questions, therefore, that this kind of analysis leads us to ponder? One of the things that has been striking me a lot recently is that we've become very good at talking in the passive voice about these phenomena that we're describing. Obesity is rising, nature is being depleted. That isn't happening by accident. That is happening by design, and it's happening by the design of the current beneficiaries of the way the system works at the moment. So when we talk about business as usual and moving away from business as usual, I want to make sure that we're not just talking about challenging business as usual in terms of farming or food production or diet, but we're actually challenging the idea that we can carry on thinking as we do about the power and the politics and the economics of the food system. We talk about the system, but we never talk about that part of the system. So this report really prompts those questions for me. Let's stop talking as if these things happen and, as if they fell out of the sky. They happen by design because the system is designed to get those outcomes. I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about this, but I want to start with the optimism that I take from the work that we do at FFCC, and I'm glad to see that you encourage more of it in your recommendations. When we talk to citizens, when we talk to people, they do not want this. This is not the world that they want, of food, of farming, the environment, of climate, of a future which is more precarious for them and their children and their grandchildren. Citizens really get the issues. They get that it's complicated. They want a world that is greener, healthier, and fairer for everyone. They want big and bold ideas, and they want to be inspired. So I think, preparing to answer the questions that were on the preparation sheet for us, how do we really take up the leadership that people want from us in this system, with big ideas, the challenging ideas, the bold ideas that give them something to get behind, because that is what they tell us they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Sue. So, Daniel, now you may not have had sight of these questions, so we would welcome, as well as reflections on what you've heard, any highlights from your time as Minister that are relevant to this space and to these discussions.
They were all highlights, but never mind. Look, first of all, can I thank many of the people in this room for the support and help you gave to me, not only in opposition, but in government. And thank you, Neil, for the work that you've done. I think I came to virtually the launch of this a few years ago. And anyone who came into my ministerial office will have noticed your book prominently displayed. So officials were left in no doubt about my direction of travel, influenced very much by the work that a number of you have done. A couple of observations. In fact, Neil gave me the report this morning. I've been devouring it this morning because as a minister, I've been waiting, hopefully, for this report to appear because I think it is so very, very useful. So the first thing I'd say is it's a really important contribution and I think it will be really, really helpful. I've also learnt a new term, pervasive agro-normativity, which I'll be dropping into speeches. I rather guessed that might be you, Neil. I was playing a game to myself of spotting the contributions. I think I spotted Dustin's 20% of land producing just 3% of calories. But there's so many contributions from people in this room, and it's actually brought it together, I think, in a really, really powerful way, and I'm sure that my colleagues will be looking at it very closely. But just a couple of things. One thing I noticed you talking about in it was the need to operate at a regional level. And I think that's really important in England, because I think it's been an assumption that England is one system. And it always seemed to me that Scotland and Wales had the opportunity to operate in a way that reflected their needs. And it always seemed to me to be hard to design a system for the whole of England. Not that it should just be for governments to design, which I think is an important point in itself. But the main point I'd just like to briefly address is that first one: how do we create the political space for action? Because I think if I'd known the answer to that, I'd probably still be in the job. And it's not a new dilemma. And the points you made, I thought, Neil, about the cross-government action, how many times have people said this over the years? And of course, Henry Dimbleby pointed out very effectively in his piece a year or so ago. And I'm delighted to see that your suggestion is to set up a committee, a National Food System Transformation Committee. Well, that was my idea too. And I think part of the issue is when we talk about government, of course, we're talking about both political level and official level. And my observation would be that there was actually rather good official level working on some of these issues leading up to the starting point of the food plan that I announced in July. And also at junior ministerial level. We had no difficulty having a cross-government junior ministerial agreement, and no one really objected. How could you object to many of these goals? I think the problem always comes at the very top. And it's not a criticism, it's a reflection of the fact that the way our political system operates is highly polarised, and it doesn't lend itself perhaps to these kind of much more nuanced long-term discussions. And that, to me, is the challenge. How do we create the political space? Well, that probably means getting political buy-in right across the political spectrum. Frankly, I don't think that's too difficult across the mainstream parties at the moment, but much more difficult on the extremes. But even so, that should not stop us trying to do that. And then making the point, very much backing up what you said, Sue, that the public aren't resistant to this. It's actually politicians' fear of going with the grain of what is already happening. Your point about animal numbers is absolutely right, Neil. If you look at it, it's already happening. So we don't have to do that much more to actually turn this into an opportunity, not just for the climate and for nature, but also for people working in the food production system too. So my reflection is, I remain optimistic that this is doable, but it absolutely needs this kind of work to make it happen. And thank you very much for all that you have done.
Thank you. And I think those last two messages about hope and positivity are particularly important. So now we're going to open up to the audience. If you have any questions, I know you've been warded off by Neil Ward of very specific questions about numbers, but does anybody have any questions? There's a hand that's gone up over there. Can we have a microphone? And there's one there.
Hello, Susanna Bolton, Independent. So I'd just like to follow on some of the points that were made around the politics. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the creation of a committee would seem like a really good, important first step. But as we know, so many of the actions are in departments and decisions are devolved. How likely or how important is it that we actually look at this across all 4 devolved nations? And how can we use that to actually take lessons from some of the positives that are happening in some of the other devolved nations around some fairly progressive policy making in areas related to this, to use to build some greater momentum across the whole of the UK?
Who would like to take that one?
I don't mind starting.
So you're right, lots of this policy is devolved, but lots of the issues are not just national, they're global. So, of course, there needs to be a high degree of join-up and connection from global governance. You know, how do we govern more effectively the global agribusinesses that are shaping both food systems and indeed food policy in all of the countries, but then also right down to grassroots. How do we resource people in places who are already doing and making progress on the things that we're talking about here? So taking a kind of layered view as well as joining up across silos is really, really important. I think you're right to point out that the devolved nations have perhaps made more progress on important issues. The Good Food Nation Bill in Scotland, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, local food partnerships in Wales, are both policies that England needs to learn from. We're not going to do this as one nation. We are going to have to show some global leadership and global connection. That would be my next big encouragement to this government, to step into that space and take up global leadership where it is at the moment. Let's call it fragile.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad you went first, because I thought good to mention Wales, because Wales has got very, very good examples of nutrition transition work and thinking about supply chains differently as well, building regional hubs and things like that. But it's against a backdrop of a very centralised, capitalised system, globalised system of food supply, and where we can change that has to be obviously at a cross-nation level. I'm always interested in thinking about which policies are devolved. Obviously, agriculture policy is devolved, but other regulatory policy areas are not. So thinking about how we can use that opportunity to ensure that we can create an environment that farmers can do a transition fairly. I mean, we recently produced a report on the pig and poultry sector, which showed just how concentrated that sector has become in very small areas around processing units, and that's created a huge problem, particularly for the environment, ecosystems, rivers and soils in those areas. But it's done for a very good reason, very efficient and logical reason from a perspective, but that report is all 4 nations have got that problem, and we need to solve it from a all 4 nation perspective, to think about whether we should be carrying on in that direction, or we should actually be implementing policies such as new permitting regulations that will stop further growth in concentration and size of the very industrial pig and poultry sector, which isn't good for our health. It's certainly not good for the environment and all the animals. But thinking about that, for instance, planning policy, permitting policy, all these things across all 4 nations. So yeah, it's got to be a cross-nation approach. It doesn't make sense otherwise.
Yep.
Yeah, there were 11 universities that led the proposal for the AFN network, which included representation from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, as well as England. So we've always been conscious of that. Don't just take the UK sort of for granted, but think about the geographical differences. As a geographer, I find that sort of variable geometry, it used to be called, John Major talked of Europe being variable geometry, didn't he? But there is a distinctive geography to all of this. I mean, on the trees front, that's skewed very strongly towards Scotland. And I was looking at planting rates the last year for which data was available, and 75% of tree planting took place in Scotland. And then 20% was England, and the other 5% was split between Wales and Northern Ireland. So, and there's quite different rationales for agricultural support and a different profile in those schemes. So the issues do play out differently in the different parts of the UK. And yeah, I think that's something, I think there are other big initiatives that have got, that pan-UK perspective really hardwired into what they do on the land use, the Lunds Hub, for example, and the Lunds projects. Yeah.
Right, thank you. I think we'll take another question. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Carol Wagstaff from the University of Reading. Thank you for the report and this opportunity to discuss it. It's great. I'd like to talk to you or ask you about change. The call for food systems change is loud and clear and has been for some time. But as Neil, you pointed out, and Tim, you pointed out, if you look back 15 or 25 years, it's not as if we're in a static situation now. The world is changing. And Sue, you made the point that when you consult with citizens, Remember that people that run businesses are also citizens. There is a vision and an aspiration, and people want particular things. And for me, the stumbling block comes when we actually ask people to do something differently. That particularly when you're in a situation of having to make decisions about what you can afford to buy and whether you've got the time to cook it or whatever, actually getting people to do something differently, to change those behaviours, to maybe take a risk, whether that's a risk with a farm budget, a household budget, your business budget, that's the stumbling block. But change has clearly happened over the last 15, 25 years. Not all of it good change, not all of it planned change, but change has happened and there have been factors that have pushed that change. What can we learn from those changes that have happened in the recent past that have caused people to do something differently, whether it's highly disruptive factors, COVID and so on, that we can now bring forwards and say we can use those levers in a more planned way to engineer the food systems change that we all know that we need so that we can get citizens, businesses, farms to do something differently to work towards this common good.
Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in on that.
Yes.
Just to start with, I think it's a great question, Carol, and I think first of all it is really important to focus on some of the success factors that we already know exist in the food system. So we have got really good evidence from things like the soft drinks industry levy that when you reorientate the food environment by removing sugar from fizzy drinks, for example, that isn't choice editing. People can still go out and buy fizzy drinks, but sugar has been removed from the diet. There's also other really good examples like the National Planning Framework, where we're restricting the opening of junk food outlets near schools. So again, you're just restructuring that environment so that by default it becomes healthier. You're not actually asking people to make a different choice, you're just delivering better options. And similarly, some of the restrictions that we've seen in cities around advertising, Vicki raised it earlier, marketing and advertising is very, very influential in terms of the dietary habits and intakes that we have. So there are many examples, I think, of great policies that we already have in place and in fact could be scaled. When we scale those policies, what we're doing is delivering healthier diets by default without putting the emphasis on individual responsibility or choice. So I would point to some of those examples.
Thank you, Ali. Sue?
I love this question, so thank you for this. There's a thing called the change equation, which has been around since 1955, and for the scientists in the room, it's not actually an equation, so please don't come at me. But it's got a number of components. It says that the dissatisfaction with the current state, the version of the future that is more compelling, the means and the method to get there has to be greater than the pain or the cost of that change. Mm-hmm. And the reason that it's not a real equation is that there's a multiplier, there's a times between those components. Dissatisfaction times the version of the future times the method to get there must be greater than pain or the cost of change. And what I very often say to my team and to anybody else that will listen, is that because it's a times in there, if there's a zero or a low value in any of those components, then it will just not be greater than the pain or the cost of change. And when we ask that question, why doesn't change happen? It is usually because we're not looking really closely enough at the drivers for change, the dissatisfaction, or the more compelling version. And the thing that, I think, I'm probably repeating myself a bit here, the thing that we simply do not talk enough about is that there is not sufficient dissatisfaction with the current state being generated for those who are the current beneficiaries of it. So for me, the absolute key now to change is to make it increasingly expensive, difficult, or even illegal to carry on with business as usual, whether you're a global agribusiness or a food processor or a polluter. It must become increasingly impossible for that to happen. Because until the dissatisfaction with the current state, until that burning platform is hot enough to force people into a different future, the psychology of change means that they're just not going to do that. And I think building too on the point that you're making, Ali, there, the big changes in public health over the last couple of 100 years or so have been when governments have just mandated change.
Exactly.
Clean air, clean waters, seatbelts. When government gets a grip and says, this isn't good enough, we're not having this anymore, Government 101, protect your citizens, we will legislate for the kind of society that we want. That's when change happens. So at the moment, to paraphrase the great sainted Tim Lattin, who I don't think is here with us today, a government policy that continues to leave it to Tesco's is never going to generate the kind of change that we are all talking about here, citizens included. So I think the big call now is for government to recognise that citizens care, people care, they want to see change happen, and now the ball is in government's court.
I agree with all that. Wonderfully put. Oh, sorry, Daniel. I was just going to say, I think we have seen change in farming. We've seen change in farming. I've seen farmers embrace, and they're worried. They've got a potential disaster with soil loss, or they can see opportunities in finance or payments from the government, and they've started to really embrace agri-environment opportunities, changing the way they farm to reduce their costs, potentially, but also reduce the impact on nature and wildlife. And, you know, if anybody's been going to the Groundswell conference and all the many other conferences now that are around, you know, it's just blossomed. And that part of the change, which I think one of the factors, is listening to your peers. And, you know, your peers or your family, your colleagues, other businesses around you. And that is what Groundswell grew from. And I think it's a very powerful thing, but I absolutely agree with Sue. I'm very well known for saying, if it's not in a law, I'm not interested. You know, we need to have the underpinning structures there, the finances, the regulatory frameworks, the advice and training support. You know, we're calling for a lot more money for training and advice for England. You know, Wales has got its advisory service. We haven't got free advisory service in England, and we really need that to really ramp up and to be also a collaborative, facilitative approach so farmers can learn from each other. So that's sort of one answer to it, but I agree with what everybody else is saying too. Daniel, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, you didn't interrupt me. I was hoping not to answer, but partly because there's a delightful paragraph somewhere in the report, which I can't find now, which says something like, there will be some difficult trade-offs to be negotiated. And I thought, yes, I'm familiar with those. And that is the problem here, I think. I mean, I think the previous question about price was really important, because there are some real dilemmas for the current government on that, and it's something which I found tricky, because as a DEFRA minister, you have no levers to pull on price. But of course, somewhere in government, there really ought to be, it seems to me, because is it a question or not that should be left to Tesco's? And when prices are going up as much as they have been in the food sector for a while now, I think it's legitimate to ask questions as to where the money has gone through the food chain. But I would slightly, not disagree with you, Sue, on the difficulty of mandating here. It's just I do think food is slightly different from clean air and seatbelts, because food is just so fundamental in so many ways more than just feeding people. And this is where I think the social sciences point comes in, because it's about culture, it's about a whole range of things, and that's why governments are nervous to intervene. But my final point would just be on the price thing again. I mean, we do know that people are very price sensitive, and whilst people want a lot of these good things, the evidence still tends to suggest, and we've had this back from the supermarkets in droves, that it's still price which is the driver. And we've got to find a way through that, because if it's too expensive for people to eat healthy food, then they will go on making those choices, which is why I rather agree again with you, Ali, that it's got to be, these have got to be taken further up the chain, so it's not left to individual responsibility.
Thank you. I think those are a good set of answers to a very good question. I mean, I'd just come back briefly on Sue's point about the equation. Something that's bothering me about the political extremes is that it's very easy to talk about the cost of action, but that's against an unquantified cost of inaction, and that's the problem we have. So I spoke about, you know, the commendable and hopefully unshakable commitment to net zero, but that's something that is a concern. So yeah, I think that's something we have to keep in mind. So, you have a question? Oh, right, we've got a series of questions. Right, we may have to pick up the pace a little bit. So we're going down here because I pointed down here. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Judith Irons. I work for Two Sisters Food Group as Food Systems and Sustainability Director, and I'm a previous food champion for AFN. It's a delight to be here, and congratulations to everybody for the report. It's a joy to read it. I'm just fresh from a meeting with some consultants who work with Henry Dimbleby, thinking around food, diet, food strategy, and potentially what further change may be on our doorstep /here coming very quickly in our direction, which is the impact of GLPs. And it came to my mind when we were talking around change and change in behaviour, and the consumer and the retailer, and I've worked in various different retail organisations as a buyer. And you do just respond, you clearly it's financial decisions, but you are responding to where the consumer's taking you. When I was running the Nando's procurement chain during COVID, I bought a lot of chocolate brownies, as people were very sad and they were at home and they ate a lot of chocolate. And we couldn't have necessarily predicted that, but that's what happened. And these things sometimes you can't predict, and they're not in our reports and they're not obvious, but the human factor and human behaviour and psychology is there. That seems like something that's very difficult for business or food system to get into, but suddenly we are on the cusp of perhaps an enormous intervention in the guise of GLP-1s. And when GLP-1s come in tablet form next year, at the moment there's 2.5 million people in this country taking them. The graph is exponential. I'm just wondering, just particularly to Ali actually on the panel, but just from the panel's perspective, this is fascinating time to be in the food industry when we're suddenly going to see a huge change to potentially consumption. It's potentially a massive opportunity at that cusp and that Venn diagram between sustainable and healthy and impact on public health, public finances, economy, productivity. There's obviously a huge amount of unknowns in there as well. It feels really exciting and it feels quite tangible, and who knows where it's going to go, but I'm very interested to hear the panel's perspective on it.
Okay, thank you. Ali.
It's a good question, and actually we do talk a little bit about GLP-1s in the report, although not in detail, because I think it's fair to say at the moment that we just don't have the kind of level of evidence that we would want to be able to make assumptions about how this is going to affect population health for long term. So I guess I've got probably two thoughts. One is that, pragmatically speaking, we understand the moment that we're in. We have a national obesity crisis, and therefore we have ended up in a situation where GLP-1s are going to become mainstream. I think we all recognise that. The second point, though, as a nutritionist on the panel, is that there are some concerning elements of GLP-1s, and I really do not think that we should just be framing this as an opportunity for our population. We do not know what that's going to mean for people's micronutrient intake. We don't know what it's going to mean in terms of frailty. And there's going to be some big questions around accessibility, because if you're accessing these drugs from the NHS and you have availability for 2 years and then you come off the drugs versus populations which can afford to stay on those drugs longer term, then I think there's some really big questions around equity. So, I recognise kind of where we're at, but I think for me, from a nutritional perspective, there's some really big questions that still need answering, and also some longer term concerns as well.
We had a webinar.
Yes.
We had an AFN webinar. Victoria Stevens from, I think she works in Henry Dibbleby's team. So that's available on YouTube through the AFN website, but we had a really good session talking through some of the implications of the new drugs.
Great. Right, I'm going to increase the cognitive load on the panel now by taking 3 questions and then asking you to field them. Yes, please do grab your pens and paper. So, question, we've one there, one on the end there, and one there just for ease, and then there'll be another round as well. So, all right, who gets the mic first? Go, first question.
Hi, thank you. Dustin Benson, Forefront Advisors. Coming back to what we were saying about the political extremes, I want to encourage you to, or rather I want to ask whether or not something that they're doing, which is very effective, would be something that would be effective for driving up the political space for action. The extremes know how to make us afraid. They know how to harness negativity. My question is whether harnessing the negativity we see in physical climate risks, which are going to impact the food system, and indeed the geopolitical bent of politics, where we might not be able to import all the food that we might want to for the price that we would like to, are an opportunity to drive up the political space for action in this space? And if so, what do you see the risks of that type of strategy as being?
Thank you.
Hi, Tom McMillan from Ag Impact. I guess sort of similar vein in a way on that first question about political space. How, I guess I'm wondering, listening to you all, how far that sense of the nervousness and the lack of political space for some of this is sometimes of a little bit of our own making in terms of how we think about the nature of change and, you know, the kind of sense of the scale of transformation that's needed, and also the kind of job of like what it takes to do something like this, or to think about those cross-government relationships or whatever, that you know, how we go about trying to join this stuff up. And that tends to end up with us thinking of kind of quite a short list of quite big things, some of which might sound quite scary. Whereas when you look at what a transformation might actually require, you're probably talking about really, really long lists of things to do. There's like a plethora of things, many of them, most of them probably actually almost kind of below the radar. You know, like Daniel, you mentioned, you know, kind of going with the grain. Like loads of them are going with the grain. Some of them aren't, but the trade-offs often are quite small when you get to the actual things that anybody, particularly in government, can do nationally or locally or wherever. And so I'm wondering how far, I guess if you're thinking about the art of the possible in a way, and you go, when you're describing these scenarios or thinking about change, how much can you do without primary legislation, at that kind of operational level of collaboration you're really getting across government? And you know, is there a lot with an empowered, if you like, an empowered civil service, empowered junior ministers, and that kind of permission to get on with stuff? Actually, you can manage those trade-offs, you crack on with a lot of change. It just might not be all sort of announced in advance in a big strategy. And so that's, I guess, it's sort of what's how much of this can be done without having to grapple with that almost kind of cross-everything job of, you know, where's the political space to do progressive stuff at the minute? Because it's like hard to come by, isn't it? So, you know, that's what I'm pondering.
Thank you, Tom. And our third question.
Hi, my name's Andrew Stark from the Eating Better Alliance. There's clearly a theme because my question's about politics as well. But I guess I'm really interested to hear the panel's perspectives about the role that AFN, and particularly that phase one that you outlined, Neil, could play in creating some of the safeguards against the net zero consensus. We're seeing the Conservative Party, for example, wanting to ditch the Climate Act, the rise of Reform, who are predicted, I think a YouGov poll a few weeks ago said they would win a majority. And with elections in Wales and Scotland next year, these are very clear threats to net zero. And I think there's a lot of people in this room who take that for a given, but we're increasingly seeing a lot of people outside of this room in society who understandably feel very disconnected from the political system and might vote in ways which damage the net zero consensus, which we've just heard what those futures could be. So I guess there's a question for the panel about what are the real join-ups that we need to be making with other aspects of society to ensure that we don't lose the progress that has been made to date.
Great, thank you. So we've self-organised these questions. These may just be the most pressing questions, I think. So who would like to go first? Yes, Sue, thank you.
They relate beautifully, so thank you for that. I sit on the Net Zero Council, and these are the questions that are coming up all of the time now. It's what we're talking about at pretty much every meeting, through public participation working groups, through the communications working groups. And I think actually there is a lot that we can learn from where change is already happening. There's been a few things said this afternoon which we all tend to say to each other over and over again, and yet when we stop to think about them, I wonder how true they are. So things like, you know, how transformative can we really be? You know, we should just ask, essentially, we talk ourselves down, we should only ask for small things. But when we look around at where the massive changes have happened around us in the last 10 years or so, we've left the European Union, we have a president in the US who has no interest in evidence or research or data or the law or any of those things, just does stuff. And I think we've talked ourselves out of the big and the bold for far too long. We've talked ourselves out of really understanding the sense of disconnect that citizens feel, that everyday people feel from the political space around them. And we carry on talking in really wonky ways that we enjoy. You and I enjoy these conversations, don't we, Dustin? But we've forgotten how to talk in real terms, in real words, in real language, with real people about the things that they care about. We haven't fully understood just how disconnected people feel from the world that they have at the moment. And we've talked ourselves out of the opportunity for being big and bold and brave and just say, we're just going to, just FDI. I mean, look, I censored myself there in honour of the building that we are in, but you know exactly what I mean. So actually, I think those are the lessons we could start to learn. Think about the language that we're using. I think we have to be careful about using the language of net zero right now, but we need to be saying to people, how would you like warmer, healthier homes? How would you like food that doesn't make your kids sick? You know, let's talk in really simple, really straightforward language, and let's say, if we do this kind of stuff, we can change this really quickly. And people will back that. So I think we just have to muscle up. I think we have to put our big boy pants on, big girl pants on, and muscle up and be as bold and as iconoclastic as those others have been, because they won.
Thank you.
Vicki? I think one of the things that is really critical here is to consider where power lies, and you mentioned it, and where the power lies in the system. And we have, particularly as we're talking about food, let the power, and I see that still with politicians sort of leaving the food system to the industry. And I think you're absolutely right. We should be talking to people about why they should have more power. And I don't just mean farmers and workers in the food system, but eaters. I don't call them consumers. So thinking about how we could do that better. I mean, sometimes over the years, people have said we should have a food bill and things like that. And I'd say, there's no political space and things like that. But one of the things that I've seen that succeeded so well years ago when I worked for Friends of the Earth, and it was deeply frustrating to me because it took all the resources from my campaign, was the Big Ask. And it was called the Big Ask because it was a huge ask to have a Climate Change Act. At a time when climate change wasn't at that high up the agenda. It was getting there because, you know, from 72 we knew we had a problem, but it wasn't as big as it now. We weren't talking about net zero, but in the noughties, Friends of the Earth designed this Big Ask. It was bold, and it had the kind of language, and it had pop stars, and it had all sorts of activities, and every MP got, I think, something like 3 constituency visits, not just postcards and emails. They actually were visited by groups of people concerned, and it really worked. It was a huge campaign, and a lot of people were involved. Friends of the Earth led it, but that kind of big, bold, powerful generation of public concern actually did work, and it led us to the Committee on Climate Change and budgets that do have an impact. I think, you know, we're right about net zero and the threat, but thinking about generating that kind of level of public concern for our food system, which feeds us and our soil and the worms and the, you know, whatever, is critical. There's nothing more important. I think there's appetite there now. I think there is. We could do something like that.
Great, thank you. Did we just want to come in?
I was supposed to do the Today programme this morning, the 6:50 slot, they said, and then they moved me to 8:40, and then I got there 15 minutes before I was due to arrive. They said, we've overrun, sorry, we don't need you now. But I was talking to the producer yesterday, and the reason she was on for having me on was when I said, Ed Miliband finds it quite comfortable saying we need to deal with energy security. Putin's Russia, you know, holding us, you know, to ransom, and so it's very comfortable and easy for politicians to talk about energy security. Yet food security is in a slightly different place, and it's been less comfortable to talk about sort of interventions to protect and enhance food security. So she really liked that and said, "Oh yeah, come on tomorrow," but it wasn't to be. So I think. you know, you can deal, a lot of drivers and pressures and challenges around net zero, you know, you can talk about them and deal with them without ever using the net zero trigger word, which I'm quite comfortable with, but I do appreciate it. You know, people are finding it very technocratic and alienating and seeing it as a series of impositions. So actually you can write a roadmap for resilience and barely mention net zero, and if you follow this critique and this prognosis, you end up with a better food system, better food security and resilience, and net zero gets sorted out almost as a side effect. The other thing I would just point to on the sort of change and the scale of change, we spent a little bit of time in the report talking about the immediate post-war period. I think it's page 51 if you want to follow it up. And we had a webinar on this. But you know, that was really extensive change over a couple of decades in the 1940s and 1950s. And you know, I don't think that was driven by quantitative targets. I don't think anyone said we want the average dairy herd to be, whatever it was, 21 cows in 1960 and 60 cows by 1990. It wasn't that kind of, but that's where we got to through a series of transformations, which I think we can learn quite a lot from, about the way they were talked about, the way that the farming industry and government and the manufacturing sectors around agriculture and food processing kind of worked together. So I do think there's a lot to be learned from history, and we shouldn't leave history just to the specialist historians, but we should all be brushing up on how we did big change, including how we're changing the energy sector, you know, large scale. You know, that is a little bit turbulent, but it seems to be proceeding at a pace that we're rather envious of when it comes to thinking about the food system.
Yeah, thank you. Daniel.
Well, look, inevitably it must fall to the politician to also address that political question. I think the struggle that we're having on telling this story is not dissimilar from the struggle that the mainstream political parties are having in general in explaining anything in terms that people understand. I very much agree with Sue's point. I remember as a trade unionist sitting in a national meeting where one of my council colleagues said, and she was from Canterbury, said, we don't have austerity on our estate, we just can't pay the bills. Because all we were talking about was resolutions about austerity. No normal person talks about austerity. And that stuck with me for many, many years. And I think it's exactly the same point here, that I don't come across constituents, even in Cambridge, strangely enough, by and large, on the doorstep, who talk to me about net zero, but they do observe how much food costs. So we've got to find a better way of telling this story, and it goes back to very good questions from Dustin and Tom. There is an opportunity here, but what we have struggled, as I'd say collectively as politicians, is to actually tell stories and weave narratives rather than, and it's partly the pressure of the daily news cycle, I'm afraid, which demands announcements constantly, when in fact I think we should just be telling a story time after time after time. And sometimes people say we can't talk about the food system honestly because we could never say that food should cost more. I just point out that food has cost a lot more. And that's the story you need to be telling. A bit like Ed Miliband is proudly saying, look, the reason we're doing this is not just because it's the right thing to do, it's because it will produce cheaper energy bills. Well, I think that's what we should be saying about the food system too. There's a whole series of reasons why we should be engaging with people, not demonising the industry, which I think there is a danger sometimes of doing, but working with industry, which is highly effective, to give people what they actually want, which is healthier, more sustainable food.
Yes.
I just want to make one. I'm not going to have a heated debate with you, Daniel, because I had such respect for the work that we were able to do together. But it's the second time you told me off. I think you're addressing me, demonising the industry. Well, but anyway, I just want to pick that up because I spent my life researching, practicing, writing books about the power of partnerships and collaboration. It's in my bones. I have slightly changed my mind. And I'm kind of going back to my Ron the Roots. I want to pick fights. I want to have a bloody fight. because I agree. at one level, demonising a whole industry is ridiculous. We work, and in fact there are some in the room today, we work with businesses for whom doing the right thing is absolutely in their DNA. They've been set up to do the right thing. They are doing their best to do the right thing, often undercut by those that are doing the wrong thing. And I have to ask myself, for how long, as a chief exec, as a chair, as board members of global businesses, each earning, millions of pounds in salaries and bonuses every year, and who are using that money to R&D, continuing to R&D bad foods, unhealthy foods, which they know are unhealthy, who are continuing to pay their lobbyists to slow up the pace of change. For how long do we have to say, but yes, do this collaboratively? Can't I just point and shout at them now, please? Because it's them that are slowing the pace of change. I think we have to differentiate.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think to some extent it works both ways, because Henry, in his report, was saying that they would welcome the legislation about a level playing field that would allow them to operate in a better way. So
they say that, but they're still bloody lobbying.
Of course,
Don't
of course.
forget.
No, absolutely. Right. So I think we'll take a final set of questions. Right. So where are the microphones? We have the microphone at the back there. David. And then we may get another set in. But then the reception. Yeah. Thank you. So, yes, please.
Okay, I'm Khalid Mahmood from the British Society of Soil Science. Honestly speaking, I like what you have said. I mean, I've been sort of working with smallholder farmers in Asia and Africa as well. There's a lot of greenwashing. So I think these claims which are made by our corporates, they are, to be honest, I was actually in a big event last year in, I think beginning of the year in Frankfurt, in a textile event. Again, cotton is a crop which produces food, fiber, and energy. But I was talking to people, they said, okay, yeah, do you have a cotton which is grown real cotton, or you have a certificate? There's a whole greenwashing. So I think this is where we need to bring this power back to the consumers, and that has to start back from the schools. We need to educate our children. One thing we've just been trying at British Society of Soil Science, just bringing a soil loan box, just teaching kids how to play with the soil, to understand the living life of the soil. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, did you get a microphone? Okay.
Hello. God, it's like winning a prize, a golden ticket to get a question. Paula Chin from the WWF. I'm a bit of an interloper because my policy expertise area is actually circular economy, but I'm finding lots of similarities in the kind of policy-making thinking. One thing we haven't explicitly talked about, I don't think, is about this absolute laser focus on economic growth right now. Through all the conversations we're having with various departments, even though you'll hear from policymakers, oh, we've got, 4 pillars of the measures we want to introduce, but then it becomes very clear that economic growth is absolutely the priority. And dishearteningly, although in the round a very positive conversation about elevating the conversation from not just food security, but nutrition security as well. And I've had the privilege of seeing the food calculator and walked through by Juan Pablo, so we understand there's a layer where it doesn't look at nutrition needs. But this particular senior DEFRA colleague said that in terms of food security, economic growth is key. The wealthier we are as a country, we can buy our way out of the food security crisis. This felt so wrong on so many levels, but from speaking to other people around this framing that the government is taking, how on earth do we cut through that? It reminded me really of, in the circular economy space, where we talk about you can't recycle your way out of the plastic pollution crisis. I genuinely believe we can't buy our way out of the food security crisis. So what do we need to do to move it upstream to mitigation, adaptation, circular solutions, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm David Baldock from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. There's only one country in Europe which has come anywhere near doing anything like what you're talking about. there's only one country that's done anything like what you're talking about today, and that's Denmark. And they have made really major changes in their food system. And there are at least 3 critical drivers behind that, one of which is they decided that agriculture had to play a vastly larger part in emission reductions in the national thing. And we haven't really had that conversation in the UK, and we can have it around the 7th carbon budget. We haven't really started on that yet, and it will look different. Second driver, and there was an enabler, was the fact that the government is willing to put very large sums of public money on the table. And this is obviously a little bit more difficult for us to imagine. So what would be a UK version of this, where the money on the table was coming a lot more from the private sector alongside a proper contribution from the public? And the third very interesting driver, something we haven't talked about today at all, is that the government got all the stakeholders in a room and kept them there for quite a long time. And really there's a negotiation. This involved industry people, not only food industry people, but people from outside the agriculture sector who did not want to reduce their emissions if agriculture wasn't doing enough. So this is a proper stakeholder debate. It's a lot easier to do in a small country, but maybe we haven't really thought quite hard enough about how we could get that kind of stakeholder buy. If, as Tim said at the beginning, we really are serious about our emissions coming down, then we do need this sort of scale of thinking, I think, not incremental change.
Thank you. Right. Panel. What do you think?
I've got a quick response on the greenwashing question, because I think it's a really interesting dilemma to consider, actually. On the one hand, we can't leave it to the market to kind of fix the issue of greenwashing. We know that that's really prolific. It's not just greenwashing. We see it in nutrition all the time, where there's plenty of claims on unhealthy foods, which are inherently bad for us. But on the other hand, we do need to be able to communicate with citizens around environmental claims to some degree. So I don't actually have an answer to it, other than I think there needs to be much better regulation around the kinds of codes of conduct that we want. But what I don't think we should do is downplay environmental messaging or considerations, because we do need to make sure that we're continuing to engage the public in a narrative that brings them in to the issues that we're talking about today. And then just a quick response, Paula, on the economic growth point, is that when it comes to health and nutrition, this is about economic growth. We're spending £270 billion from the economy on treating issues associated with poor diet. So my way in on these conversations is actually to position this as an area of economic growth and an enabler of economic growth. And I'll be honest that sometimes that is a door opener into the right policy conversations.
Daniel.
Yeah, just on the last point first, I think there is actually a lot more work going on in government than you might imagine on those issues, but I don't think enough perhaps has been said publicly about it yet. But I would say there's a lot of work going on looking at how we can do that. On the economic growth point, I would disagree with your account of that. Certainly, we want to see the food system in this country successful. We think we can do more. Buying our way out of it is absolutely not the approach, not least because buying our way out would probably mean buying more from other countries where we've got less influence over standards, and that's not the outcome we're looking for. But the transformation that's needed, in fact, is in this report, because what we know is we're not growing enough fruit and vegetables in this country, we're not growing enough pulses, and we need a transformation, and that certainly is being strongly worked upon as well. And I haven't mentioned the Food Strategy Advisory Board, but in a way that was a form of the committee that you're suggesting in the report, Neil. And there's going to be a lot depending upon the success of that. And yes, it is working with industry, but I would defend that to the extent that it is industry that is going to need to change to bring many of these things about. And I think having a good partnership with industry, demonising or not, is going to be the most likely way to succeed, for exactly the reason that you said, that many people want to see a level playing field, a proper framework to allow people to do the things they can't do if they're being undercut.
Thank you. Sue.
I'm picking up the growth question. I think in a way, this does go back to one of the earlier questions about how change happens. And I think one of the things that we know about the psychology of change is in moments of crisis, people can only really listen to, hear from, be advised by people they think get their world, that look a bit like them, feel like them, who feel like one of us, not one of the other. So on the growth question, I think the appropriate level of challenge, growth of what, for whom, who benefits, how do we grow the real economy, the material economy, how do we grow the things that change people's everyday lived experience, that sort of conversation is going to have to come from the business leaders who really get that and who want to engage in that conversation with Department of Business and Treasury. So it's probably not going to be me being shouty and cross and fighty, saying to Rachel Reeves or her officials, grr, be cross. It's going to be the voices of the very many business leaders who are very clear about the conditions that they want to see that help them grow the kinds of businesses that have a material impact on the lived experience of people in the UK, in their health, in the quality of their communities, in the jobs, the good jobs that they can expect and have a right to expect, and the kind of world that they live in. So I think as a strategy for engaging in those really difficult questions, I think we find our advocates. It perhaps relates to the point that you were making a bit earlier, Vicki, about the big ask. We have to find the advocates that can properly connect to the people that we need to influence. And on the Denmark piece, I'm a great fan of the Scandies. What the Danes did was agree a plan, which it actually took them 7 years to put in place some of the features of the changes that you were describing there. So it was systematic, it was inclusive, it used all of the public resource, it used, the power of public procurement was really crucial in some of that change. So instead of talking about additional money or other investment or private investment, it said, where is the money right now? And what is it doing right now? And is it effectively lined up to give us the outcomes that we want? So how do we corral what we've already got much more effectively and make a plan, a 7-year plan that really systematically shows the pathway to a more sustainable food system? So it's kind of quite unsexy in one sense, but it's quite entish, isn't it? I often think the Scandies are quite entish. But it was deliberate, and it was thoughtful, and it was systematic. And there's a lot to learn from that.
Vicki.
Yeah, just on the question of education, I know there was a big debate in Parliament yesterday about the idea of getting children in schools educated on where their food comes from. It's a great idea, brilliant. And it's partly stemmed from the success of the 6 Inches of Soil campaign. Film. It was a brilliant film, if you haven't seen it yet, but it's all about soil, but about farmers learning how to farm with nature and successfully as businesses, and it's now being shown in schools. There's a short version being shown. That's all good, and soil focus, absolutely. I find when I talk to people about soil, which I try to quite a lot, they are fascinated because they know nothing about it. So I think that there is something there, but it would need more to counter the education that comes at children, as is said in the report. I can see that's telling them what to eat. The many hundreds of millions of pounds telling them what to eat and what's good to eat, what makes them look cool to eat, what will make them, I don't know, how they advertise is unbelievably magic and smart and clever and a big part of the problem. So we can't counter that entirely through education, but I think it's a very good point, and greenwashing should actually absolutely be legislated against. I was going to talk about what you were saying, David, about the thought of all stakeholders in the room and getting together. We've had so many food strategies. I mean, I include in food strategies that wonderful one that Labour came up with just as they lost power in 2010, which we'd all worked on for many years, and it was very good, cabinet-led. So I'm slightly nervous about doing that again because we have all the answers. This report has the answers. But you're quite right in getting it. And I have to say, I think it does go back to what Sue was saying about being really honest about where the problems lie, where the money's going, who's got the power, and addressing those big problems. You know, farmers are getting 10% of the total gross value added of the food chain. It's not enough to help them to do the things they need to do. They can do a lot. I mean, we're doing a lot of work with farmers on what we call maximum sustainable output, when they're reducing their inputs and costs, getting a same level of profits, and actually reducing their harm to the environment. That's a really exciting way of looking at farming, looking at the books on farm, and a guy called Chris Clark has sort of modelled it. There are many probably other similar tools, but it's exciting, but it does need the environment out there at the farm gate when the buyers are buying the food to be fair, and to have the contracts that are fair, and to have the kind of policies that drive the production levels. Because, you know, it's mostly what farmers are growing are driven by what the supplier, the chain is asking for, not what government tells them to do. So we've got to get that right. And I think my final point was going to be that we've got to get all these ducks in a row in the land use strategy, in the food strategy action plan, which is now coming in spring, in the 25-year roadmap. These all should have the common thread of getting this right, and getting emissions reduction in agriculture, but many other things that are outlined in this report.
Thank you, Vicki. Okay, right. Well, I think we get please join me in thanking the panel. If you have further questions, I'm very sure they'll be happy to speak to you during the drinks reception. So before we close, I just wanted to finish with some thanks of my own and on behalf of the co-leads. One point is that we're missing one of our co-leads, Angelina Sanderson-Bellamy, who, as well as being a food system superstar, is quite the athlete, something that runs in her genes. So she's out with her daughter in South Africa. I think she's competing for Wales in is it life saving? Yes. So that's where Angelina is, but she has played a very important part along with the other co-leads in leading the project. We've thanked the champions, we've thanked Jez, we've thanked Juan Pablo. Particularly in relation to the roadmap, I'd like to recognise Elta Smith and Ali Morpeth and Veronica Moran for their input. In terms of our excellent project team and the event today, Claire, Molly, Karen, John, Alison and Sophie. And thank you. And finally, some of our co-investigators who've been here, and some of them asking questions as well. So Lynn Frewer, Christine Watson and Tom McMillan. So final thank you is to all of you for coming and engaging. I hope you'll join us now for some drinks. Thank you.